There's a scene in the book of Acts where Paul is on the beach and he's been in community with a group of people for a while, and he says, I'm compelled by the Holy Spirit to move on, and there's weeping and there's crying. But missional community, which is what we're involved in, we're a community, but we're all, God sends us and brings us, and we're always people in motion. So it's part of the nature of the kingdom that God sends us out and brings people. There's always that kind of tension, because in our hearts we want to keep everything together, we want to hold everyone together, but actually, we were sent to you, these guys have been sent somewhere else, and it's just that continual work of the kingdom and being sensitive to the Spirit. So it's just bless you guys. We just pray grace for the next season and just multiply everything God does, and we just pray for special relationships and a whole new community to come around you. Amen. Okay, so we continue with our series, Parables of Jesus. Had two great talks, not from me, which have been wonderful. I've had Steve Burnhope spoke a couple of weeks ago, and then we had Chris Walters last week. Two great talks. If you missed those, do catch up on our YouTube channel, because you'll really enjoy them. Today I'm returning to this theme of lost and found. We began the series, I looked at the two parables together. I looked at the parable of the lost sheep and the parable of the lost coin, and we looked at this whole theme of lost and found that we find in Luke 15. I'm going to return there today in this theme of lostness. We're going to talk about something else that's lost, not a sheep or a coin, but this time it's a son, it's a person. And this is the longest parable recorded in the Gospels. So we're going to spend some time going through Luke 15. Now, this is traditionally called the parable of the prodigal son. So if you grew up in church, you probably would have heard this talked about as the parable of the prodigal son. And the word prodigal has become synonymous with somebody who's gone away from God, somebody maybe who's left church or you haven't seen for a while, and they're classed as a prodigal. It's become associated with someone who's sort of turned their back on their Christian faith. I've been to many prayer gatherings where we've prayed for the prodigals to return, the people who've gone away from church or faith to come back to connect with God. But actually the word prodigal doesn't mean lost or backslidden or turned away from God at all. Actually, it doesn't mean any of those things. It means actually this. It means recklessly extravagant to the point of foolishness. That's what prodigal means, recklessly extravagant to the point of foolishness. So nothing really to do with being away from God, but we'll see why that term is used in this story. Let's read from Luke chapter 15. There was a man who had two sons. The younger son said to his father, "Father, give me a share of the estate." So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. I remember why I put that first slide up now, because I wanted to quickly return to this context that Jesus paints for us. Luke tells us that in the audience that day, we had tax collectors, sinners, and teachers and Pharisees. So we had these two different people groups in this place listening to the words of Jesus at that time. That's really important for the context of the stories that Jesus tells. So there's another context as well we need to be aware of. The vast majority of Jesus' audience were people who were living on the verge of poverty. They were living almost like a subsistence kind of lifestyle. And for them, it was just a struggle to survive every day. And because of this, they weren't always very good at keeping the religious laws that the Pharisees would have liked them to keep. If they couldn't afford a sacrifice to go to the temple and sacrifice for their things, their misdemeanors, well, then they'd fall behind. If they had no food for their family, perhaps they might have to go and work for a Gentile on the Sabbath. That was the only day available for the work. They'd have to take the work just to get money, just to survive. If you were poor or a widow or divorced, you would have to do all you could do just to survive, just to help your family to survive, even if it meant not keeping all those rules of the Torah in the way the Pharisees would have liked you to keep them. The Pharisees in Jesus' audience were convinced the reason the Messiah hadn't returned, the reason the Romans had come and occupied them was because of the people's sin. They were convinced the ordinary people, the way they lived, the way they didn't measure up, they were preventing all the fullness and goodness of God from happening at that time. So they heaped condemnation onto the ordinary people who were already struggling to live. So not only are you struggling to get by every day, but you've got this religious kind of conviction and guilt placed upon you by the leader saying you're not living to a good enough standing. Just look at what's happening around us. It's your fault. And that's why Jesus clashed with the Pharisees so much. He was good news for the ordinary people, but he didn't hold back on confronting the Pharisees in the way they laid condemnation upon the people. And through his teaching, we often see Jesus sort of saying subliminally to the people, God understands what life's like for you. God understands how tough it is for you. He doesn't blame you. He's for you. He's not against you. But the Pharisees, their tunnel vision, their authoritarian view of the Torah, they really doubled down on condemnation for the people. How they chose to apply the Torah, how they chose to interpret it, was often at the expense of the well-being of the ordinary person. In Matthew's Gospel, we see an account of Jesus in a synagogue on the Sabbath. There's a bit of back context there. The disciples had been caught sort of gleaning wheat from a field as they walked through because they were hungry, and it's the Sabbath, and they were grabbing a few bits to eat from the fields they went through, and the Pharisees saw them, and they said, your disciples are doing work on the Sabbath. It's not allowed in Torah. And in this synagogue is a man who's got a withered hand. We don't know whether he's had an accident or whether he had some sort of paralysis or condition, but Jesus sees him. He's got a withered hand. And it's a tricky situation for Jesus because he wants to heal the guy with the withered hand, but it's Sabbath, and the Pharisees are all watching. Is Jesus going to do work by healing on the Sabbath in the synagogue and risk being arrested? Because the risk is, if you do work on the Sabbath, you could be put to death. That was the penalty for doing work on the Sabbath. So Jesus seems to be in this cleft stick. Does he or doesn't he heal the guy with the withered hand? But Jesus goes on the offensive and he says this to them. He says, if any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Then he says to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, it was completely restored, just as sound as the other. But the other Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. Jesus highlights to the Pharisees, regardless of the Torah, regardless of the interpretation of the Torah, the right thing to do is to bring healing, is to bring well-being. That's what the word means here when Jesus said it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath. The word good there means it's the morally right thing to do. It's the morally right thing to do to lift your sheep out of a pit if it falls in there, because it might not survive if you leave it one more day. It's the morally right thing to do to alleviate someone's suffering by bringing healing to a man with a withered hand. The Sabbath was designed to help people with their well-being. The Pharisees, though, saw loving God as passionately following the commandments over the well-being of people. Whereas Jesus said actually, and interpreted the Torah differently, he said actually it's the well-being of the people that comes first, specifically the poor people, the oppressed people, the underprivileged people. So Jesus heals the man's hand. He rewrites the interpretation of the Torah in a moment. It's a new day. He demonstrates the coming kingdom that's arriving in his ministry. And you realize the significance of this moment because the Pharisees know this is a key moment. This is an act of public defiance by Jesus. So what do? They go out and they plot how they might kill him. They realize this is a pivotal point in the power that's moving from the religious establishment to the new day that Jesus is bringing the gospel. So this is, again, it's a fuller understanding of what Jesus is speaking into when he shares this parable in Luke 15. So back to the story. The story begins with the younger son coming to his dad and demanding his inheritance. So effectively, he's saying, Dad, I wish you were dead. Give me your money. That's effectively what he's saying. Dad, I wish you were dead. give me your money. You're not dead. I want my money anyway. Now, assuming there's just two sons that are mentioned in the story, there's no other siblings, well, the younger son would get a third, and the older son would get 2/3 of all that the father had, the money, the possessions, the property, and importantly, the land as well that the father owned. Now, for us, in a modern context, the idea of trying to give a bit of your inheritance away to your kids early is not an unusual thing. It's actually quite tax beneficial. So we often get older parents trying to give away a bit of their inheritance to their kids to help them before they die. But in Jesus' time, that was a big no-no. You didn't give away your money, your land early. In fact, you didn't give it outside the family context. It was a very strange idea. And the people that would have been listening would have gasped from the crowd as they heard the opening few lines of this story. It was shameful, wishing the father dead. And not only that, you wouldn't abandon your family business. You wouldn't sell your family land. It was the only way you could guarantee you could survive, to bring in a crop, to bring in food. But the son, he wants to convert it all to cash, and he wants to travel to a distant country. It's shameful what the son was requesting. It's also shameful that the father let him do it. This whole story starts from a position of shame. And that's really important. That's where we start. If the start of the story wasn't scandalous enough, it gets worse. The son goes off to a distant country and he throws it all up the wall. He spends the lot, squanders his wealth in wild living. That's why he could be classed as a prodigal son, because he's reckless with his money. He just burns through it. We don't know what the wild living is, but we can guess. He has a good old time. He burns through the money, no restraint, until he's utterly broke. Utterly broke. So not only has he asked for the inheritance early, he's then gone and squandered the family's hard-earned wealth. So now the son is an utter disgrace in the story. And then the lands plunge into famine, Jesus tells us in the story. And the only option left for the son to survive is to go and work for a Gentile farmer who happens to keep pigs. Now, for the Jews, the pig was a completely unclean animal. They wouldn't go anywhere near one. And so the son has to go and work with the pigs. And now he moves into a place of being utterly humiliated. The son sunk to the lowest point he possibly could in this story. Now, at this point, the religious leaders on one side are probably thinking, absolutely, this story illustrates what's wrong in society. This is the point. People, living like this, living without restraint, no holiness, no thought for God. This story illustrates everything that's wrong in society. Whereas the ordinary people are probably thinking, yeah, this story does illustrate a lot of things that kind of resonate in my life, because I've made quite a few messes and I'm struggling to figure out how I'm going to move forward, and I've probably sunk to the lowest of the low. So you've got these two different groups here, hearing this story in different ways. The Pharisees resonating with the slipping standards, but the ordinary people thinking, yeah, I can really understand how someone can get themselves in a situation like this. No food, no money. Because Jesus says in the story, no one gave him anything. And that's not there by accident, because this person's in deep need, but no one gave him anything. He was starving. And the ordinary people could probably resonate with the shamefulness of his situation. They probably thought about things they'd done they weren't proud of just to survive. So two different responses going on in this story. At this point, the son has a reality check, it says. He comes to his senses. He says, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. So he got up and went to his father. The son decides if he's going to survive, the only thing to do is to go back home. To go back home and face the music. He prepares this speech for his father. He's thinking, I'll get there, I'll just say these words, and that probably helped me get through. I've sinned against you, I've sinned against heaven, I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. maybe we're like one of your hired servants. Maybe I can work and pay off the debt. Maybe I can work and pay off the shame. He sets out. Now again, the religious leaders will be thinking, great, this is where the son gets it. This is where justice is done. He's going to go home and he's going to get it. About time too. He'll be humbled, he'll be humiliated, he'll be punished, he'll be basically made to work off the debt. This is what should happen. This is how things should be. This is exactly what he deserves. And I'm probably thinking, Jesus, we quite like this parable. We like where this is going. We like the fact that you're talking about people getting what they deserve, getting justice. Actions have consequences, and this boy needs to face the music. These sinners need to get what's coming to them. And the ordinary people in the audience would probably have been thinking the same thing too. Yeah, this is where we get it. This is where the consequences come. This is where the establishment comes on top. Because they've been told their whole lives they were messing up, they were falling short. They were letting people down. And they're probably thinking, yeah, God's probably angry with us in the same way the Father's going to be angry with the Son. He's going to get it when he gets back home. And the mess the Son was in probably felt a lot like the mess they were in at the time as they listened to Jesus. So at this point, everyone's expecting the same ending to the story. Everyone's expecting the Son to go home and to get it. And probably something like this. He'll go home, the Father won't be available, the Father will make him wait, stand outside in the baking sun for hours and hours, sweating it out. And the Father will go out to him, he'll be aloof, he'll be distant, he'll be critical, he'll punish the Son, and he'll say basically, yeah, you're no longer worthy of being called my son. You can work for me, but hey, you're dead to me. That's what they're expecting the end of the story to be like. The Son will be punished and exiled for what he's done. That's how everyone expects the story to end. These are just the downward spiral of consequences for this guy's actions and his choices. It's the culmination of what he's chosen to do. That's where he's ended up. But there's a big but coming. But while he was a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. This is the hinge point in the story. The great inversion of everything Jesus' listeners was expecting has been suddenly flipped on its head. This downward spiral is about to be reversed into an upward spiral of redemption and grace in this story. Because it seems like every day since the son has gone, the father has been watching and waiting for him to return, looking out to the distant horizon, waiting for the son to return. Rather than giving up on the son and just handing him over to his choices, the father's been watching and waiting and hoping that one day he'll come back. And that's how he sees him. While he's still a long way off, the father sees him. And the father runs out to him. Why does he run out to him? Well, perhaps he wants to run to him because he wants to just quickly get to him, but maybe also he wants to save him from having to come into the shame of the village. Perhaps he wants to get to him first and restore him and bring him into the village in a different way. Perhaps he wants to protect him from the shame, protect him from the abuse. Now you have to remember that respectable Jewish men did not run. I know it's very vogue to run now, but back in the day, you did not run anywhere if you were a respectable Jewish man. You did not show your legs if you were a respectable Jewish man. So for the father, he had to scoop up his robes, he had to reveal his legs, and he had to run. More scandal in the story. The listeners thought, oh my goodness, yeah. This is a scandalous story, exposing his bare legs, more humiliation. Now the father's humiliating himself, the son's humiliating himself, now the father's humiliating. I mean, it's just humiliation upon humiliation. But not only that, he gets to the son and he hugs him and he kisses him and he is pig stinking. Now, we've got some pigs just over the road here, okay? There's a guy over the road, I met him a few years ago. He's a retired teacher, and his passion when he retired was to raise pigs. Go figure. So he's got some land over the road, and he bought a couple of pigs, and started to have a little pig farm. The pigs have now turned into big pigs, more pigs. And when the wind's blow in the wrong direction, they really do smell piggy. They really do have an aroma about them. Now, pigs are great creatures. They're lovely creatures, intelligent creatures, but they do pong a bit when the wind's up. So I can imagine this son must have really honked when he came, and the father gets to him, and the pig is an unclean animal, but he embraces him and he kisses him. He draws him into this intimate connection immediately. And again, the crowd are thinking, oh my goodness, hugging a pig boy. Oh. You can imagine, they're just like, ooh. The son starts his speech, the one he's practiced, the one he's memorized. Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father cuts him off. The father stops him before he can get to the bit which says, make me like one of your servants. He doesn't let him get there. He says this to him, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. They begin to celebrate. The robe was a sign of honor. The father wanted to dignify the son. The ring was a sign of identity. So there's this honoring taking place with that. The sandals on the feet were, well, normally slaves or servants went around barefoot, so to restore footwear to him would have shown actually he wasn't a servant or a slave. He was a member of the household. Kill the fattened calf. Well, the father wanted to have a feast that was big enough to invite the whole village to. He wanted to show the whole village that his son had returned and had been restored and wanted to be celebrated. The father wants to bring the son back into a place where he's completely forgiven and restored. That's the big inversion of this story, the big but in this story. This is actually what the father wants to do, not to punish and exile him, but to completely forgive and restore him. And this is why this parable could be called the parable of the prodigal father. Because the father is being recklessly lavish and extravagant to the point of foolishness with his love to the son who has come home. So that's nearly the end of the story. That would be the Hollywood ending, wouldn't it? Fade to titles. But it doesn't end there. It doesn't end there. We're all thinking, that's probably the audience thinking that's the good news ending. The religious leaders wouldn't have thought that. They thought, hang on a minute, what just happened? We were expecting punishment and exile, but actually, Jesus, this guy has been kind of welcomed back with open arms. Where's the consequences? Everything in the story so far has been bad news, and then suddenly this happens, Where's the hero in the story? Where's the person who's going to bring justice? Where's the person who's going to drive home the consequences? Well, here he comes. He's the older son. The older son was in the field. When he came near to the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. Your brother's come home, he replied, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound. The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered to his father, look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him. And the Pharisees are probably thinking, at last, this is our boy. He's going to really put it to him. This guy knows what it's like to work hard, uphold the standards, face consequences. The son's acted shamefully. The father's acted shamefully. The older brother's the only one in the story who actually is showing any moral backbone in this whole shameful story. This is the guy who's taking the stand. This is the guy who takes sin seriously. He's the hero. The father goes out to plead with him to come in and enjoy the celebration, but he refuses. All he gets is abuse. And you might be thinking the older brother has got a fair point. He's worked hard. He's been the one who's actually, not done anything wrong. But remember, back at the start of the story, when the younger son asks for his inheritance, the older brother doesn't say anything. He doesn't try and talk the younger son out of it. He doesn't try and support the father. He's aware that he's got 2/3 coming to him. So to keep quiet probably benefits him. He's probably quite happy with the 2/3 that are coming his way because it suits him. And then when the father comes out, he's refused going to the party. He's brought shame on the father. When the father comes out, all he gives is abuse to the father. He's angry at him. He criticises him. He makes a scene. All this was as dishonourable in Jesus' time as what the younger son had done. To dishonour their father in this way publicly was just as humiliating and dishonourable and shameful. We don't know if this older son ever goes into the party. We don't know if ever the father talks him round. Jesus just leaves it there. He leaves the story hanging. It just ends with this. My son, the father said, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because of this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So what would these two groups listening to Jesus' parable have taken away from the story? Well, the religious leaders probably have realised this isn't a story that puts them in a good light. They're struggling to figure out who the good guy is, who the bad guy is, because they now think, well, the guy we thought was good has ended up looking quite bad. And worst of all, they seem to have completely misread the character of God. Because clearly the father in the story is supposed to represent God. But this God, in this story, doesn't seem to be doing the sort of things that they thought the God that they serve and worship would do. They're shaped by a God who's a religious conservative. They're shaped by somebody who would double down on the rules. But the ordinary people, the tax collectors, the sinners, must have been overjoyed with the new picture that's been painted of God by Jesus. Because he's saying there's a chance for people like you and me who get ourselves in a mess. And when we come home, there's a God who's waiting for us to restore us and to love us. So rather than fearing a God who's going to judge them and condemn them and punish them and exile them, if they come home, there's a God who receives them and honours them and welcomes them. And I'm thinking, can that really be the sort of God that's there? Can that be the God that we can connect with? We get this beautiful come as you are picture, don't we, from this story. The father didn't wait for the son to be washed down from his pigginess and get all cleaned up. He just ran to him and embraced him and kissed him. Come as you are, a son or a daughter, come home to the lavish embrace of the Father. Be welcomed, whatever condition you're in. You don't even have to make a good speech. You don't even have to have the right words. You can just come and the Father will welcome you. Not slavery, not servanthood, but sonship and daughtership. And so the Father is prodigal. God is prodigal, recklessly extravagant with his love to the point of foolishness. See, one final thought to think about here. The older son was just as lost as the younger son. Even though the older son stayed home, he was just as lost as the younger son was. He just didn't realise it. He just didn't realise how lost he was, even though he stayed home. He completely failed to understand the nature and character of the Father. And so he couldn't enter into the rejoicing of when the younger son came home. He completely misunderstood the Father's priorities. And in fact, we can see in this story that both sons lose sight of the Father's love in some way. The younger son saw the Father as someone who brought restriction and prohibition, so he wanted to get away, cast off restraint and just go and basically live without limits. And that resulted in isolation and pain and destitution for him. And the older son saw the Father as an ungrateful taskmaster that drove into a life of brooding legalism and resentment and bitterness. Both sons had no clear view of the father's love. In fact, the father is the only one to come out of this story utterly blameless. He's the only one whose character is utterly intact in this story. And Jesus tells us this story because our view of God will determine our life and our choices. It will determine how we live our life. Our view and understanding of God's love and his view of us will determine how we live. And as you read this parable, you see a God that runs to meet you as you turn to walk towards him. You see a God that draws you into an intimate embrace, even though you're in a stinking mess. You see a God who wants to dignify you and honor you and give your life real purpose. You see a God who wants to put a ring on your finger to signify that you are part of the family, that you have authority. And you see a Father who puts sandals on your feet so you don't act like a slave or a servant, but you act like a son or a daughter. And that would have been the good news those ordinary people would have heard that day. The Pharisees would have gone away muttering and tutting and plotting, how can we get rid of this guy called Jesus? But for us, again, as we listen to that parable today, it's a beautiful, perfect picture of the Father, of God. So I don't know what your picture of God is this morning, how you think about him, how you think he thinks about you. But this story reveals the true nature of the Heavenly Father that we worship. He loves you, he welcomes you, he accepts you. With all your mess, you come to him just as you are, and he embraces you, and he kisses you, and he celebrates you. If you're able, why don't you stand with me? Sometimes we don't really know how we think about God until something happens. So the younger son, he has a moment where he comes to his senses. He has like a moment of revelation. The older son has a moment when he's provoked, when something comes up before him, and he thinks, well, that's not right. That's not how it should be. And that provokes him. At that point, both of them have an opportunity to refresh and understand, actually, what is God really like? The younger son goes home and discovers a father who is forgiving, gracious, wants to restore. The older son is locked at the end of this story in legalism, wanting justice, wanting restitution, wanting something. But the father says, look, this is my character. I'm extravagant with my love. Trust me. Trust that I know how to do this. You know, sometimes we put ourselves in a position where we think we know more than God. We think we have a better perspective than God. Something may have happened in your life recently that's kind of provoked you or caused you to think again about how you see God. I want to encourage you this morning that the Spirit's here and God can reveal himself afresh to you as this beautiful Father who recklessly and extravagantly wants to pour his love out on you and maybe on people around you you don't think deserve it. But that's his choice. That's his choice. So let's just pray.